the curse that never existed, and still terrified the world. On November 26, 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter made a small hole in a sealed doorway, held up a candle, and peered inside. Behind him stood his patron, Lord Carnarvon, who asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter answered with a phrase that would go down in history, "Yes, wonderful things." Behind that door, untouched for 3,200 years, lay the almost completely intact tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. Golden statues, war chariots, jewelry, thrones, and, at the very heart of the complex, a sarcophagus with the golden funerary mask now known around the world. In life, Tutankhamun hadn't he actually been a particularly significant pharaoh. He took the throne as a child and died, by most estimates, around the age of 19, without accomplishing anything that would place him alongside the great conquering rulers of Egyptian history. Ironically, it was precisely this historical insignificance that saved his tomb. The tombs of more famous, more powerful pharaohs had almost all been looted in antiquity, while the modest burial chamber of a forgettable young king was simply overlooked, its entrance accidentally buried under debris from later construction work nearby. This was the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. And within less than a year, it had turned into one of the most enduring myths of the modern era, the story of a deadly pharaoh-esque curse that, according to the newspapers of the time, began killing people one after another. The man who died first, Lord George Carnarvon, who had funded Carter's excavations for nearly 15 years, didn't he live long after the tomb was opened? In the spring of 1923, roughly 4 months after the discovery, he died in Cairo, of blood poisoning that developed after he accidentally nicked a mosquito bite on his cheek while shaving. The wound became infected, sepsis set in, and Carnarvon's health, already fragile after a serious car accident years earlier, gave out. The death itself was tragic, but medically unremarkable. In the pre-antibiotic era, blood poisoning was frequently fatal, but the press didn't seize on the medicine. They seized on the timing. A man opens a pharaoh's tomb, and just months later, he is dead. That was more than enough to launch one of the most successful newspaper sensations of the century. How a coincidence became a curse, it's worth pausing on the writer who essentially invented the modern myth of the pharaoh's curse. Marie Corelli, a popular British writer of mystical novels in the early 20th century, published a letter shortly before Carnarvon's death claiming she had read in a rare Arabic book that terrible punishment awaited anyone who desecrated a pharaoh's tomb. No one was ever able to find this book afterward or verify that it existed, but the claim appeared in the newspapers at exactly the moment the whole world was already feverishly following the excavation. And the coincidence with Carnarvon's subsequent death lit the fuse. What followed was an effect we now call viral. Newspapers, including quite serious publications, began running pharaoh's curse stories one after another. Every time someone even loosely connected to the excavation fell ill or died, regardless of the actual cause, journalists added another name to the growing list of victims. The rumor was further fueled by a legend claiming an inscription had been found above the tomb's entrance, threatening death to anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. No official archaeological report ever recorded any such inscription. It appears to have been pure newspaper invention, but it spread around the world faster than any correction ever could. There's also an almost comical detail that only poured fuel on the fire. On the night Carnarvon died in Cairo, the lights across the entire city supposedly went out simultaneously, and his beloved dog, left behind at the family estate in England, allegedly howled and died at that exact same moment. Neither claim was ever documented, but details like these, eerie, cinematic, perfectly suited for a headline, are exactly what made the myth immortal. How many people made the list of victims by the mid-1920s? The press had counted more than 20 victims of the curse, people who, in various ways and with varying degrees of actual connection, had come into contact with the tomb and subsequently died. The list included archaeologists from the expedition, casual visitors who once toured the dig site, and even journalists who had simply written about the discovery. The problem is that the list falls apart under scrutiny. More than half of the people who actually worked inside the tomb alongside Carter on a sustained basis, the ones who spent real months of intense physical labor there, breathing in thousand-year-old dust, went on to lifelong lives afterward. Howard Carter himself, the man who literally was first to step across the threshold and who spent more time near the pharaoh's mummy than anyone else on Earth, didn't he die until 1939, almost 17 years after the discovery, at the age of 64, of lymphoma, an entirely ordinary disease for a man of his age. British Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, one of the first people inside the tomb right after it was opened, lived for more than a decade afterward. Lord Carnarvon's own daughter, Lady Evelyn, one of the very first people to follow her father and Carter into the burial chamber, lived past the age of 80 and died only in 1980, in the 1930s, and more systematically in later decades. Researchers attempted to statistically compare the average lifespan of people who had been present at the tomb's opening against the lifespan of their contemporaries of similar age and social standing who had no connection to the excavation at all. No meaningful difference was found. The people cursed by the pharaoh, on average, died at roughly the age they would have died at anyway. What might have actually been killing people there is, however, a far more mundane, and in its own way, no less unsettling, explanation for at least some deaths linked to ancient tombs in general. Sealed, unventilated spaces that have stood closed for thousands of years really can accumulate hazardous substances. Mold and fungal spores, particularly of the genus Aspergillus, can remain viable in such conditions for centuries and cause serious lung infections in people with weakened immune systems. Enclosed ancient tombs have also sometimes shown elevated levels of ammonia and other toxic gases produced by the slow decomposition of organic embalming materials over millennia. Some modern researchers, studying similar cases in other ancient tombs, have suggested that at least some of the unexplained illnesses among archaeologists over the decades may have had a genuine biological cause, just a far more mundane one than a curse, poor ventilation and disease-causing microorganisms rather than the wrath of a pharaoh. But even accounting for that possibility, no convincing medical evidence of mass poisoning or infection along these lines was ever found specifically in connection with Tutankhamun's tomb. Canaries, cobras, and other details that grew into legend there as another story that almost always resurfaces in retellings of the curse, the story of Howard Carter's canary. Shortly before workers uncovered the steps leading down to the tomb, Carter had reportedly acquired a yellow canary, whose singing, according to local workers, brought luck. The discovery of the tomb's entrance happened to coincide with the bird's arrival in his household. Then, on the day the first sealed door was opened, a cobra, a sacred animal traditionally associated in ancient Egyptian iconography with the protection of the pharaoh, supposedly slipped into the canary's cage and killed it. It has a striking story, almost literary in its symbolism. The bird of luck killed by the pharaoh's guardian serpent at the exact moment his tomb is breached. The trouble is, the story is known only through second-hand retellings by contemporaries, often contradicting each other in the details, and it appears in none of Carter's own diaries or official reports in his own handwriting. And yet it has precisely these kinds of details. Small, cinematic, easy to retell in a single paragraph, that spread far faster than dry facts ever could, and they ray what glued a scattering of coincidences into a single, coherent myth about a curse. Rumor also added far more distantly connected people to the list of victims. Radiologist Archibald Douglas Reed, for instance, was said to X-ray Tutankhamun's mummy for scientific purposes but died before he ever began the work, and although he technically never once set foot inside the actual tomb, the press included him among the curse's victims anyway. A similar fate befell American financier George J. Gould, who reportedly visited the excavation once as a tourist and soon after fell ill with a fever during a trip through the Mediterranean. None of these cases holds up to serious medical or chronological scrutiny on closer inspection, but it was precisely the accumulation of dozens of such half-stories that gave 1920s newspaper readers the impression the curse was reaching literally everyone who so much as brushed against the subject. The curse as a business. The curse quickly acquired a very rational commercial dimension as well. Shortly before the excavation, Lord Carnarvon had signed an exclusive deal with the Times for coverage of the expedition, infuriating rival papers that suddenly found themselves cut off from direct access to the story. Starved of official information, competing newspapers compensated for their lack of facts with an abundance of speculation, and the curse angle turned out to be the perfect way to keep publishing tomb-related stories without waiting for Carter and the Times to release anything official. Later, in the second half of the 20th century, the myth of the pharaoh's curse became an industry unto itself. Dozens of books, documentaries, and of course the Hollywood Mummy franchise, which launched as early as 1932 with a film released just a few years after the excavation and directly inspired by this exact story. Every new generation of popular culture found its own way to retell the same plot, and with each retelling, the real, dramatically rather unremarkable facts, blood poisoning, pneumonia, ordinary old age, receded further and further into the background. What has left of this story today? Tutankhamun's golden mask is one of the most recognizable artifacts in human history, a symbol of Egypt every bit as powerful as the pyramids themselves. And the myth of the pharaoh's curse, despite having been thoroughly and repeatedly debunked by historians, statisticians, and physicians alike, continues to live a life of its own in popular culture, in mummy movies, in video games, in tourist brochures promising visitors a chance to touch an ancient curse for an extra fee. And there is a certain irony in that. The real marvel of 1922 had nothing to do with the curse, it was the opposite. A handful of people with kerosene lamps and notebooks managed to preserve and meticulously document an untouched tomb that had stood in darkness for over 3,000 years, without destroying or looting it. It was work that took Carter's team 10 long years, a systematic inventory, sketching, and conservation of thousands of individual objects before a single one of them ever left the tomb. No other discovery in the history of Egyptology has ever been documented with that level of care. But apparently, a story about painstaking, methodical scientific work simply can't compete with a story about an angry pharaoh's revenge. It is just attempting to believe that behind a golden mask that spent 3,000 years in the dark lies something more than a remarkably well-preserved artifact of ancient history. And that is precisely why, 100 years later, we're still not really talking about the discovery of Tutankhamun. We're talking about his curse.